Dr. Evan Osler with Fitness Education Seminars. Welcome to this edition of Fitness Insider, where we'll continue our conversation on conditioning the psoas. If you missed part 1, feel free to check it out before continuing with part 2. So what did we learn from part 1? Well, we learned the greatest obstacle to learning is actually what we already know. It's not because we have a lack of information available to us in books, seminars, internet, from our peers. It's because it's what we know already that often prevents us from learning more information. The second thing that often creates obstacles to our learning is our own ego. So if we can check our ego, we can have a mind that's open and ready and willing to learn and be open to different ideas, even if we've learned something completely to the contrary. In part 1, we also learned about the function of the psoas. In school, we learned that the psoas was primarily a hip flexor. Well, as we discussed, the psoas has extensive fascial attachments to the diaphragm, to the entire spine from the levels T11, 12, L1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It attaches to the pelvis, it attaches to the pelvic floor before it attaches to the lesser trochanter of the femur. Therefore, it is much more than just a hip flexor. It's a dynamic stabilizer of the trunk over the pelvis. It's a dynamic stabilizer of the lumbar spine, the pelvis, the sacroiliac joint, and the hip joint, which allows us to perform running, playing with our children, playing recreational sports, basically helping us live our lives. We also learned that despite what we've learned, rarely does a over tight and short psoas cause low back pain. It actually creates a more functional position for many of us that exercise, but it's really the weak and over lengthened psoas that creates most of our low back problems. The weak and over lengthened psoas contributes to lumbar spine flexion, contributes to a posterior pelvic tilt, which we get mostly from sitting and from an over-reliance on spinal flexion type of core exercises. And even though it looks like many of our clients, like my patient here in the image to the left, is in an anterior pelvic tilt and hyperlordotic, she's actually overextended at her thoracolumbar junction. She's actually in lumbar spine flexion. And if we test her, in her Thomas test to test the length of her psoas, you can see it's over lengthened, way over lengthened, and it actually tests weak in this patient, as it does in most of my patients, probably 95% of them, that have low back pain. So again, most of our clients are in the same position that have low back pain. So we have to be careful when we're conditioning the psoas that we're not overstretching the psoas even further, creating more lumbar spine and pelvic instability. So now that we've talked about the controversies of the psoas, how the heck do we condition this all-important muscle? Well, first we have to think about its functional role. Again, and that's primarily to stabilize the TL junction. When a child pulls her knees into her chest or pulls her feet up towards her head, what she's really trying to do is get her weight up onto the TL junction so that she can develop both the strength of the abdominal wall, align the thorax and the pelvis together, and create the most important strategy we have for decompressing spinal loads, both against gravity, against external weight, and the muscles, our own muscles pulling down on the spine, and that's intra-abdominal pressure. So in order to start the conditioning process of the psoas, we're going to line our client up in supine position with her legs elevated to the 90-90 position on top of a ball and or chair or couch. And we're going to make sure that she can activate her abdominal wall and create intra-abdominal pressure by breathing three-dimensionally with that three-dimensional activation. If you need help in figuring out how to perform this and have your clients perform this, feel free to check out any of our videos at our website, www.fitnesseducationseminars.com, or just Google fitnesseducationseminars.com on YouTube. Because this pattern will set up all the additional patterns that we create in our clientele and start the process of conditioning the psoas. So we stabilize the TL junction, we teach the client how to breathe and coordinate that with abdominal activation. Now we're going to teach them how to use that psoas while maintaining the activation. So again, I activate my core, make sure I activate all the way around, the three-dimensional activation where the transverse attaches into the transverse processes and it blends with the QL and the diaphragm. and then I perform hip flexion, making sure I get pure hip flexion without any movement of the spine and without any overactivity or really much activity at all, because it's such a low level position, of the superficial hip flexors. In a minute, you'll see me change my hands to palpate the superficial hip flexors, the TFL and the rectus femoris, making sure that they stay relaxed as I perform hip flexion so that we get pure psoas action of centrating the hip and stabilizing the spine as I perform hip flexion. If you feel contraction in your clients or yourself as you do this movement, you're using the superficial muscles and you need to be able to perform hip flexion without any additional activation. Otherwise, you will not adequately involve the psoas in this motion. So it's real important that we make this activity a low-level activity. And that's where so many of us go wrong in the fitness industry, is everything we're trying to do is higher level. Most of our clients don't have problems doing higher level patterns. They have problems teasing muscles out, performing simple activities like a sliding leg hip flexion like I'm doing here in this image with very minimal effort. That's what we have to restore in our clients, especially the clients that are tight all the time and that have low back pain. Once we teach the clients how to use this hip flexion function and the psoas function, now we take it into the upright position. So again, we teach them how to do a supported squat where the rib cage is aligned directly over top the pelvis. You can see by my arrow there's no hyperextension in his lumbar spine. He's got three-dimensional activation. He's able to breathe three-dimensionally. We don't have the clients lean on the support beam. They're just using it as a guide so they can really relax their hip flexors, but keep the psoas and the core activated as they go into hip flexion. So again, he's almost pulling himself down into hip flexion, very, very similar to how the powerlifters talk about using their psoas to get out of the bottom position of a squat. We're also going to use that same concept of using the psoas to help both get into this position and then help us lift out of this position without changing the alignment and or over gripping the superficial hip flexors, tensor fasciae lata and rectus femoris. Once we've conditioned this position, now we're going to go on to our higher level patterns like the TRX and knee pull-ins, and you can do this on a slide board over top of ball, and the single leg stance where you incorporate both the stabilization function of the stance leg and the hip flexion function of the psoas on the moving leg, and you're able to activate the oblique chains, both the posterior oblique chain if you're pulling down, and you actually get a little bit of anterior oblique chain if you do contralateral shoulder flexion as I'm doing in this image. But the goal again, maintain core activation, three-dimensional breathing, and stay long through the spine even as the hip comes into flexion. There should be no change in pelvis alignment and or positioning through any of these patterns. So conclusion. Train the low-level function of the psoas. In order to get the psoas to truly function, you have to be able to turn off the rectus femoris, adductors, and tensor fasciae lata. You have to teach the client how to use their psoas without activating all the additional muscles. And then you have to teach them how to incorporate it into higher level patterns. So now that they know how to breathe and activate and use that psoas, now teach them how to use it in higher level patterns. Most clients have no problem using their hip flexors as a unit, but they do have trouble using the psoas along with their deep core stabilizers in higher level patterns, especially as they need more endurance and or strength. Third, discipline, discipline, discipline. Have a discipline to teach your clients what they need to do to get better. Have a discipline to follow it through and not jump to the higher level patterns just because they're sexy and fun. And have the discipline to be the trainer that your clients need and want so that we can be the solution to the healthcare crisis. Again, this is Dr. Evan Osar. Hope you enjoyed this webinar. Feel free to share it if you have. Hope it served you and your purposes in making yourself the best trainer that you need to be for your clients and making yourself a leader in this industry. Have a great day. We'll catch you next time at Fitness Insider.